Welcome to the Nightwatch Commander Podcast. This is the Commander speaking. This is going to be the beginning of a 3-part series on terrorist groups from history that you probably don't remember. The first terrorist group we're going to look at is going to be the FLQ. The FLQ, or Front de Libération du Québec, was a terrorist revolutionary force in Canada, the Quebecian province, fighting for the, as they termed it, liberation of Quebec from the rest of English Canada. Now, I'm sure many people listening to this podcast are probably wondering, wait, who? Who, Canada? A terrorist group in Canada. This series is going to be ultimately about how terrorist organizations and conflict in general can spring up almost anywhere with the right circumstances involved. Even the most peaceful of nations, as we see them today, can have histories that involve major conflicts even within their own borders. So, without further ado, the FLQ and the October Crisis of 1970. Part 1. Canada and Terrorism in the 1960s. In order to understand how an organization like the FLQ, terrorist organization, could come about and cause as much disruption as it ultimately did, we have to go back to the beginning of Quebec and its relationship with Canada. Quebec and the city of Montreal were founded by the French Empire almost 450 years ago. Their main dealings were in the fur trade. However, at the time of the 7 Years' War in the mid to late 1800s, the British Empire successfully conquered Quebec and took it over from the French. However, a large population, and to this day the majority, of individuals living in Quebec are in fact French-speaking, in Quebecois, tracing back their lineage and history to France, hence in the French-speaking peoples. After World War II, with the sudden industrialization of the world, and reindustrialization for that matter, the people of Quebec found themselves of the position that they needed to take stronger steps to preserve their rights and culture as French-speaking peoples. This is due to them considering Quebec to be what they considered an island surrounded by English speakers, not merely just the English ancestry of the majority of Canadians, but also of the fact that in North America, the vast majority of individuals were in fact English speakers. In addition, much of the actual conflict between Quebecois and the rest of Canada started from economic issues. Quebec had not industrialized as quickly as the rest of Canada, particularly Ontario, the largest English-speaking province of Canada, had actually industrialized at the beginning of the 20th century, and with the rapid mobilizations that resulted in World War I and World War II, also bringing heavy increases into heavy industry. However, Quebec itself had been largely left behind by this during the war and interwar period, only showing exceptional levels of industrialization after the war, Second World War, that is. As a net result, there was a number of economic conflicts between Quebecois and the rest of Canada, largely due to perceived and real discrimination between English elites and Quebecois citizens. However, the vast majority of Quebecois were not thinking of political separatism. Their ultimate desire was to have a more equal Canadian Union where Quebecois rights were respected, and the rights of their language, that they wanted Quebecois in Quebec to be able to maintain French as the primary language of Quebec itself. And their major concern was that immigration from the rest of Canada and America, for that matter, could result in a major shift in the population of Quebec, resulting in the loss of Quebecian and their French culture and ancestry and language. So they wanted to have, understandably, laws to protect such things. However, there was ultimately a shift between the two forms of this political positions. The first set, ultimately led by one Pierre Trudeau, father of the current Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to side with the Canadian Liberal Party in order to preserve Canadian unity, but at the same time gain the political power necessary to protect Quebecois language, culture, and autonomy within Canada. However, other forces within Quebec sought full secession, and as the only means of protecting, as they saw it, Quebecois history, Quebecois language, Quebecois culture. And unfortunately, within the realms of this movement, radical elements would make themselves known. In 1963, the FLQ surfaced. Part 2. The campaigns began. The FLQ, who began their campaign of terrorism with an attack on the monument in Quebec to General James Wolfe, who was the commanding British general, conquered Quebec City during the 7 Years' War. In addition to that, a campaign of bombing would go on to many other targets and would continue for many years. Their targets being, in many cases, both military, police, and English business interests. In particular, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's HQ in Quebec, the Canadian's equivalent to the IRS offices, as well as a number of businesses of English ownership. Hundreds of bombings would occur over the following years. Now, the majority of these bombings were set up with time bombs placed in locations that were not necessarily designed to kill anyone, but cause terror and disruption. Phone calls would be made after the bomb was planted, declaring that a bomb had been placed and would go off at a set time. This is not to mitigate or call them terrorist light, they were not, but this was a common terrorist tactic at the time, amongst many terrorist groups around the world. The goal was political upheaval, not mass casualty events, as we have seen with more modern terrorist plans. Despite this, these bombs would kill people. 6 people would die over the following years from these bombs, people largely in the wrong place at the wrong time, though a notable individual who deserves to be remembered for his bravery in this moment was one Walter Ledger. He was an individual who, upon discovery of a bomb in a mailbox planted by the FLQ, was attempting to disarm it when, unfortunately for him, the bomb proceeded to detonate. He was physically staring right at it. But Mr. Ledger would not join the 6 other individuals who died. He would survive the bombing. A tough cookie he was. Not many people can survive a bomb directly to the face. In response to the growing concerns amongst Canada's political elite over the possibility of increased Quebecois separatism and violence, a decision was made on the part of the Canadian Liberal Party to invite a number of prominent political Quebecians into the party's federal election group. One of them would be one Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau, through his own political machinations and intelligence, was able to finally become the head of the Canadian Liberal Party for all of Canada, proceeding to pursue a position of Canadian nationalism, but with Quebecois exceptions built into Canadian law to protect and preserve Quebecois culture and address other concerns by the people of Quebec. On the flip side, however, he was a firm Canadian nationalist and despised any concept of Quebecois secession. Vocally, he spoke out against it. In 1968, the federal Canadian election began. Trudeau would ultimately be successful, and his campaign was very well funded and very well executed. Pierre Trudeau, regardless if you think of his political opinions and positions, both on economics, foreign policy, and other issues throughout Canada, cannot be denied as an effective and intelligent politician. The event that would ultimately see his likely successful election in 1968 turn into a complete landslide for him and the Canadian Liberal Party can ultimately be found in the 1968 Montreal Jean Baptiste Parade, or John the Baptist, a major event And on the holiday calendar of Quebec, Pierre Trudeau himself had gone to the event every year since he was a child. There was a major concern, however, amongst his political advisors at his presence, as he was considered by many in Quebec to be a traitor to Quebecois nationalism. That could result in a major disruption and possibly even his own death. You have to remember, in 1968, when this happened, it had been barely a few months since the deaths of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. In the end, and during the parade, there was a major disruption. A large number of Quebecois separatist supporters attempted to disrupt the parade and attack Trudeau himself, throwing bricks, bottles, and other objects into the crowd, and ultimately at the box where Pierre Trudeau was sitting watching the parade. However, the police providing security to the event were successfully able to round up those who were attempting to disrupt it. Trudeau himself, despite being the object of their anger, and his police security attempting to move him out of his box and inside, angrily refused to leave his viewing post, and in front of all the cameras for all of Canada to watch, quite bluntly, they waved off the police force, sat down, and would finish watching the parade. The show, both bravery and brinksmanship, ultimately propelling him and the Canadian Liberals to a level of victory that few ever could possibly dream of within their party. At the same time, however, Quebecois separatism groups on the more moderate side ultimately were able to coalesce in what is known as the Bloc Québécois, a political party, whose stated goal was to create the political circumstances that would allow for the secession of Quebec from the rest of Canada. As part of their efforts, they launched their party to both run for elections, both in the provincial elections for governance in the legislature, and premier being the Canadian equivalent of a U.S. governor, over Quebec, as well as running for all the seats in Quebec for the national parliament in Canada, as a capital Ottawa. In the end, the Liberal Party of Canada managed to succeed in electing as Premier of Quebec one Robert Bourassa, and in doing so, showing that in fact, most Quebecois are themselves, while not fiercely nationalistic of Canada as a whole, not at the same time separatists either. They want their concerns, both economic, cultural, and language, respected, but they don't necessarily want to go to the extreme of separating from Canada itself as a solution to the problem. Despite this, the Bloc Québécois ended up winning 24% of the vote, successfully achieving legitimacy for their party as not merely a fringe movement. However, due to the intricacies of the first-past-the-post electoral system, this only nets them 6% of the MP seats from Quebec in the national legislature. Now, going to take a tangent here to explain this. Under the first-past-the-post system, whenever an election is occurring for a specific seat or the whole set of seats in the parliament, parties put up candidates to run for individual seats, and the individual election for those seats, the winner is determined by whoever gets the most votes. Now, when you have only two parties, this doesn't provide any problems, as someone will get more than 50 plus 1, and thus that person will win. The problem comes when you have multiple parties running for the same seat. In that circumstance, it hardly ever occurs where the majority of those who vote for an individual for that seat actually get their preferred candidate to that seat. To put it quite simply, if you have three candidates and one gets 40% of the vote, but the other two get 30 and 30%, respectively, the person with 40% wins. He didn't get the majority of voters, nor did the majority of voters want him to win that seat, but because he has the most votes, he wins. Understandably, this creates circumstances in which many people having gone through an election, seeing that the total percentage of the vote was, in this case for the Bloc Québécois in 1968, 24%, but only themselves getting 6% of the national Canadian Parliament seats in Quebec. Due to this discrepancy, the FLQ terrorist group would ultimately choose to up the ante on their actions, and unfortunately, this would result in the kidnapping of a senior British ambassador, James Richard Cross. Part 3. The October Crisis of 1970. James Richard Cross was the chief foreign trade aid minister from Britain into Canada. While not technically speaking a full ambassador to Canada from Britain, he was nonetheless a very high-up government official from the UK with full diplomatic protection under international law. After he was kidnapped from his home, the FLQ released 7 different demands. The demands are as follows. This is sourced from a college in Quebec, ex-history website, Marianopolis College, Marianopolis. Apologies for mispronunciations. Their demands were as follows. 1. The Canadian government must see to it that the repressive police forces do not commit monstrous error of attempting to jeopardize the success of the operation by conducting searches, investigations, arrests, or by any other means. In other words, the police must not get involved. Ha! 2nd, the political manifesto of the FLQ, which was delivered as part of this communication, must appear in full print on principal newspapers in Quebec and must also be read aloud on national television. Also of note, they required that political prisoners, we'll get to them, must be allowed to comment on the subject of the political manifesto on live television and at a time between 8 and 11 p.m. for at least 30 minutes, either live or between 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. on a recording. 3rd demand was for the liberation of a number of so-called political prisoners. The list is rather long, and we'll get to them later. 4th, a plane must be made available to fly them, those released and the FLQ operatives who took Cross, either to Cuba or Algeria. At the time, it was very common for hijackers, hackers, or other terrorist organizations to want to fly to Cuba for one reason or another. The Cuban government actually got frustrated at this after a while. 5th, there was a requirement for the reinstatement of a number of individuals by the Postmaster General of Quebec. Not sure where this came from. 6th, a voluntary tax, as they put it, of $500,000 in gold bullion must be placed on board the plane and made available to the, air quotes, political prisoners. When one recalls the spendings caused by the recent visit of the Queen of England, this is reading from their demands, the millions of dollars lost by the Post Office Department because of the stubborn millionaire, they know this guy, Cairns, the cost of maintaining in Quebec within the Confederation, and etc. $500,000 is peanuts! ! And then 7, they required the name and the picture of the informer who led the police to the last FLQ cell. It must be made public. They also stated that they are pretty sure they know who this person is. They just want to have confirmation. Now, mind you, considering that Demand 7 is essentially requiring a license to murder somebody, the Canadian government was not very inclined to agree to this. And in fact, at first, the government actually rejected all the demands. However, the FLQ did release information that proved that Cross was still alive. So, after some back and forth, in return for agreeing to drop a number of their demands, the Canadian government allowed for the publishing of the manifesto, demand number 2. As it turns out, this ended up being a rather big misstep, in my opinion, on part of the Canadian government. While the majority of the people of Quebec still are not for secession, a large minority of the population of Quebec actually react rather positively to what the manifesto actually stated. The manifesto itself has a number of the usual communist demands, workers' rights, death to the capitalists, etc. But it also goes into how the feelings of many Quebecians that the election was rigged, particularly in, as previously stated, how so many votes went to the Bloc Québécois, and yet they only got a far fewer number of seats proportionally to their vote count. Notable fact, in the midst of the manifesto, they proceed to start bringing up a number of colleges in Quebec's leadership. I find this a bit amusing, because it clearly is actually a get-dead giveaway that a number of the members of the FLQ are at some point or another former college students. Most terrorist organizations don't give two craps or a giggle about one particular college or another. With the conclusion of the reading of the FLQ manifesto, the Canadian government declared that they will give if only one other concession, and otherwise they won't give anything else. They will allow for an aircraft to be prepared, waiting at the Montreal airport to fly FLQ cell that kidnapped Cross to Cuba, provided that they release Cross. Despite continued negotiations through intermediaries, another event occurs that escalates the situation very heavily. Another terrorist cell, flying the flag of the FLQ, if you will. I personally believe that this cell is actually operating independently entirely of the other FLQ. The cell elected to kidnap another individual. In this case, one Pierre Laporte, the deputy premier of Quebec itself. On October 10th, 1970, Laporte was actually playing flag football out front of his house with members of his family. And when a car sped up nearby, stopped, and a number of unknown individuals jumped out and at gunpoint forced him into the car and drove away. Laporte himself was the deputy premier of Quebec, in addition to being also the minister for labor. The government, both of Quebec and the federal government of Canada, had been, I wouldn't say not taking the situation seriously. Of course, any kidnapping of a foreign dignitary is important, but the kidnapping of Laporte, being himself a high-ranking member of the Quebecian government, escalated the situation heavily. The premier of Quebec at this point, Bourassa, deciding that the government wasn't safe, and he moved the entire cabinet of the Quebecian government to a secure location in Montreal. The video showing the actual convoy is probably the most number of police motorcycles I've ever seen, guarding just a few vehicles. One of the things that actually makes this particular incident more difficult is that, by all accounts I can tell, it seems that both FLQ cells were operating entirely independent of one another. Now, this is actually part of a number of actual tactics used by terrorist organizations that are designed to make the organization look bigger than it actually is, and also make it to where it's more long-lasting. There'll be a name given to a terrorist organization, but its actual functional entity is not a singular entity, but multiple numbers of independent cells operating independent of one another, except for maybe the occasional communication or coordination, but not usually the case. That way, if one cell goes down, they can't really compromise the other, because they usually actually don't know even who the other members of another cell actually are. With the situation now having escalated even more, this new cell of the FLQ restates all of the original demands and demands that they all be actually followed through with, or else they're going to kill Laporte. This is further evidence that the cells weren't communicating with one another, because this action in many ways compromises the acts of the first FLQ cell, which had been gaining some level of sympathy. Because of this, the situation within the governments of Quebec and Canada starts escalating heavily to what will ultimately become a monumentous decision made by Prime Minister Trudeau. On October the 13th, Trudeau would give one of his most famous interviews to a reporter asking whether or not he would bring in the military, and if that was just too much. Trudeau just answered, "Just watch me." On October the 15th, to emphasize a number of the concerns that both the Quebecian and Canadian federal governments had, one of the major concert halls in Montreal got filled up with a lot of Canadian separatist supporters, or just filling up this arena in actual total support of the goals of the FLQ, if not the means certainly the ultimate intent for the full and complete secession of Quebec from the rest of Canada. Just so we can understand the flavor of this event, much of the crowd would spontaneously start shouting out FLQ, FLQ, FLQ. This event, along with the kidnappings themselves, ultimately convinced both the governments of the city of Montreal and the government of Quebec to ask for what was at the time the completely unprecedented. And that was to ask the Prime Minister to invoke what is known as the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act is essentially the Canadian system of declaring a national emergency. It had only been activated 3 times before for this moment, all of which in wartime. 2 of those 3 times before this one was for World War I and World War II. Trudeau, in what is probably his most controversial move as Prime Minister, invokes the act by fiat, with no vote in the Canadian Parliament. Trudeau authorizes the deployment of military forces into Quebec and effectively declares complete martial law. The functional action of this is to allow for the army to take over day-to-day patrolling within the city and allow the Quebecian police to search continuously for the 2 kidnapped men. Unfortunately, as part of these War Measures Acts, habeas corpus is effectively suspended. The Quebecian police are empowered to search without warrants and without limits any location throughout Quebec. In addition to that, they are allowed to arrest for 90 days any individual without having to provide them any court-appointed attorneys or actual court appearances for at least 90 days. Hundreds of individuals, most if not all having no actual connection into the FLQ, are arrested virtually overnight. And unfortunately, many of these arrests will ultimately be used against a number of the in-government of power in Quebec's political opponents. Despite this, Trudeau will ultimately give his most important speech of his premiership. He lays out the case for why such extreme actions needed to be enabled. The speech outlines a number of the demands made by the FLQ, noting that the so-called political prisoners were in virtually all cases, individuals convicted of criminal offenses, murder, theft, and destruction of public property. Not really actual political activists, but in fact those who intending to get their end goals by the rule of the fist and the gun. Trudeau himself even admits in the speech that the powers he's granted to the Quebecian police are strong, as he put it, and also, in his words, distasteful, and promises that the actual implementation of these powers will be temporary. Naturally, the main opposition parties within the Canadian Parliament are against the usage of the powers, either in and of themselves or of how they've been implemented, as they've had no input, but as there's been no vote in Parliament on their use. In addition, there's large-scale protests against the Civil War Powers Acts done at a number of the colleges throughout Quebec, with all students going on strike and leaving the actual colleges. Now, in fairness, I don't think in the middle of martial law you're going to be wanting to be in the middle of going to college anyway. However, despite all this, the vast majority of Canadians support the War Measures Act. The last 7 years of bombings and actual many bank robberies as well by the FLQ hitting on the Canadian conscious mind, and they were pretty much tired of it. Unfortunately, there would be another casualty of this event. On October 17th, the Canadian government had already made it clear that the Cuba option of flying all of the hostage takers to Cuba would remain on option at all times. All they had to do was agree to turn over their hostages. Unfortunately for Pierre Laporte, this would not be possible. On October 17th, the FLQ left a note to 2 Quebecian reporters, which led them to a vehicle. The vehicle was the same vehicle they had used to kidnap Laporte. He was found dead in the trunk, strangled to death. 2 days later, on the 19th, the house he had been held in was found. By many accounts, the evidence supplied by the police investigating in the house, it had appeared that Laporte had attempted an escape. It is likely that, in fact, in retaliation for this attempt, the FLQ cell had killed him. The FLQ cell had claimed that he had been killed as retaliation for the implementation of the War Measures Act. In actuality, as best evidence can show, it was a fit of anger at the man's attempt to resist his entrapment. Initially, there had been reports that both men were dead. The other FLQ cell, who still had Cross, had made the decision decision quite quickly to release a picture with showing Cross was still alive to the press, so as to ensure or make it clear that negotiations should continue, and that they had not killed the man. Unfortunately for Cross, this incident, along with the War Measures Act, forced the cell to go into hiding with Cross, cutting off most negotiations at this point. 2 months later, with the War Measures Act still in force, the police and the army managed to corner their location in a Quebecian suburb. Surrounding the house, forced negotiations began. After several hours, the FLQ cell holding Cross agreed that they would fly out on the flight to Cuba and release Cross, with one other agreement made with the government that upon their departure, all those arrested under the War Measures Act would be released. The government would agree. As for the other cell, before Cross had actually been successfully released, the police had actually managed to track down on the location of the other cell that had murdered Laporte. But most of the members of the cell in their safe house had managed to escape when one of their number delayed the police at the door, or allowing them to hide in a false wall. They would not, however, escape the long arm of the law. They themselves were arrested in a house in rural Quebec in St. Luc on December 23rd of 1970. All members of that cell, the organization of the FLQ, would be convicted of kidnapping and murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, in an act that I fundamentally disagree with, but nonetheless, as the choice of the government of the day, by 1982, all were paroled and released from prison. With these events, the FLQ was effectively stamped out, and the War Measures Act was lifted within Quebec. Thankfully, the Trudeau, on this regard, kept his word. You can take quite a few positions on the man, for or against his policies, but at least on this issue, he had ultimately kept his word on what would happen once the FLQ had been stopped. Epilogue. In the end, the FLQ, I think, was a sad, unfortunate result of extremism. Their acts ultimately pointless and unnecessary in my mind. The Quebecian and separatists' political movement would survive their acts, and not only survive, but thrive in more peaceful political movements in the form of the Bloc Québécois. The issue of Quebecian separatism would ultimately be decided by the people of Quebec. In 1995, the largest referendum in Quebecian history came about, with a turnout of 93.5% of the entire voting population of Quebec. 4,757,509 voters voted in the referendum to determine whether or not Quebec would secede from Canada. By a margin of only 54,288 votes, they voted to stay as part of Canada. Since then, the issue of Quebecian separatism as an actual move to secede from Canada has in many ways died off, but the actual movement of Quebecian nationalism is in many ways as strong as it's ever been. The Bloc Québécois, having grown from a minor side party, ultimately is now the largest party in all of Quebec, having gained most of the seats allocated to Quebec, seats in the national parliament. To this day, the people of Quebec are as nationalistic about their way as ever, but they have elected that they will maintain this nationalism within Canada itself. They've also gotten a number of concessions over the years, and I invite you to actually look them up, about how the Canada works as a whole, so as to preserve their own autonomy. As for the most controversial aspect of this story, insofar as the Canadian government is concerned, and that was the issuance of the War Measures Act, the first ever usage of it in peacetime. Insofar as the actual need to implement it, you're going to have to decide that ultimately individually, but I won't chicken out here. I will actually give my opinion on the subject. Was it necessary? In some ways, yes. The simple reality is that you had a major diplomatic incident going on with a foreign diplomat having been kidnapped, in addition to a major member of the actual government and also having been kidnapped. The Canadian government could obviously not allow this event to go unanswered, and a strong response was necessary. However, that's not to say, hey, I agree with the way it was used. The effective overnight detaining of a number of people who were ultimately just standard political opponents to the government in power is not justifiable. From the perspective of freeing up the police to be able to search as needed, that's understandable. Time was of the essence. However, I can see no justification for the detention of hundreds of individuals who were ultimately proven innocent. Despite that, in the end, Trudeau's political career would not only survive this incident, but thrive. He would remain the Prime Minister of Canada for almost another decade. The lesson from this is ultimately a question of how do we handle terrorism. Strong measures are sometimes necessary, but there ought to be someone in the room, devil's advocate against such measures, to try and moderate, so that we can understand that, quite bluntly, we must not lose ourselves in the fight against those who wish us harm and those who intend violence upon others. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Nightwatch Commander Podcast. Tune in next time, where we'll be addressing the terrorist group in West Germany in the 1970s known as the Red Army faction. And as always, may the grace and love of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Thank you.